In a small, close-knit community, a single prejudiced act at a local diner ignites an unforeseen sequence of events. The longtime owner makes a serious mistake by refusing service to a well-regarded veteran. As the veteran walks away, hurt by the discrimination, the owner assumes the matter is over. But he's unaware that his actions have attracted the attention of someone who has the power to confront the town's long-standing biases. What follows will astonish everyone, Sule offering a powerful lesson in forgiveness and transformation. Before we dive into this incredible story, share with us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, make sure to subscribe. John Carter sighed deeply as he climbed out of his well-worn pickup truck, feeling the stiffness in his joints, a constant reminder of his years of service to his country. The warm southern sun touched his weathered face as he looked up at the faded sign of Tom's Diner, and a small smile appeared. For years, he had been coming to this place, always drawn back by the promise of good food and familiar faces. When John pushed open the door, the cheerful sound of jingling bells announced his arrival. The rich scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, stirring his appetite. As he made his way to his usual spot at the counter, he nodded politely to the other patrons. But something was different today. The usual hum of conversation fell silent as he entered, replaced by an uneasy stillness. He felt all eyes on him, watching his every step. Trying to dismiss the discomfort as leftover instincts from his soldier days, John sat at the counter. Moments later, Tom Harris, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen. Normally warm and welcoming, Tom's face was now stony, his gaze cold and unwelcoming. John felt unsettled under Tom's intense stare. "What'll you have today, John?" Tom's voice was rough, stripped of its usual friendliness. Choosing to ignore the change in Tom's tone, John replied with a gentle smile. "Just the usual, Tom. A cup of coffee and a slice of that famous apple pie." But Tom's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the counter. "I'm afraid that's not possible, John. We're out of pie today." John's brow furrowed. Just a few feet away sat a freshly baked pie, clearly visible. "But Tom, I can see." "I said we're out." Tom's voice rose sharply, startling a few patrons. "In fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." A heavy silence blanketed the diner. John sat frozen, struggling to process what was happening. In all his years visiting Tom's Diner, he'd never faced such treatment. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, averting their eyes, while others looked on in shock and disbelief. Trembling, John rose slowly. "Tom, did I do something to offend you?" Tom's face twisted into a sneer. "You've done enough just by being here. I don't serve your kind in my establishment. Now get out before I have to call the cops." The words hit John like a punch. For a brief moment he was transported back to his youth, to a time when this kind of treatment was common. But this was different. This was Tom, a man he'd thought of as a friend for years. With slumped shoulders, John turned and began making his way to the door. Defeated. As he reached the exit, a young woman at a nearby table stood up, her voice trembling as she said, "This isn't right." Tom rounded on her, his face red with anger. "This is my diner, and I run it as I see fit. If you don't like it, you're free to leave." The woman hesitated, torn between standing up for what was right and avoiding conflict. Eventually, she sat back down, shame filling her eyes as she watched John leave the diner. As soon as John was gone, whispers filled the diner. Some patrons hastily paid their bills and left, unwilling to support such open discrimination. Others stayed, either agreeing with Tom's actions or too shocked to move. Little did Tom know, his prejudice had set off a chain of events that would shake their small town to its core. Had he known who John Carter really was, and the powerful connections he held, he might have reconsidered his actions. But now, Tom Harris had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he would soon face the consequences. Outside, John Carter sat in his truck, shaken by what had just happened. The sunlight, which had felt so comforting earlier, now seemed to mock him, highlighting the raw reality of the discrimination he had just experienced. He gripped the steering wheel, hands trembling, as waves of hurt and humiliation washed over him. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring into space, drowning in despair. Then, gradually, something changed within him. His jaw set with determination and a new fire ignited in his eyes. John Carter was many things, a veteran, a father, a respected member of the community, but he was not a man to take injustice lying down. Starting the engine, his mind was already working out a plan. Tom's diner might have turned him away, but this was far from over. Back at the diner, Tom Harris was beginning to feel the immediate consequences of his actions. Several regulars had walked out, some casting disapproving glances as they left. But Tom stood firm, his face set in a stubborn frown. He believed he'd done the right thing, holding to what his father would have wanted. So why did a sense of unease gnaw at him? As the day went on, news of the incident spread through town like wildfire. Small groups gathered on street corners and front porches, voices hushed as they discussed the shocking event. John Carter was well known and respected in the community, and many couldn't believe that Tom, who always seemed so friendly, harbored such deep-seated prejudice. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Michael Carter, John's son, sat in his office when he received a phone call from a family friend back home. As he listened to the account of what had happened to his father, Michael's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles turning white. A renowned senator, celebrated for his advocacy on civil rights and veteran issues, was shaken by an incident involving his own father, a blatant act of discrimination that unfolded in their hometown. For Michael Carter, the irony was painful yet empowering, intensifying his resolve to make things right. Ending the call with a friend who relayed the incident, Michael sat back, carefully considering his next steps. He could certainly wield his influence to bring legal repercussions to Tom Harris, the diner's owner, and turn this episode into a powerful example. But as much as he wanted to act decisively, Michael knew that sometimes direct retaliation only sows deeper divides and resentment. No, this moment required a different, more calculated approach. Leaning forward, he dialed a number. There were favors he could call upon, and Tom Harris was about to learn that actions have lasting consequences. As the sun dipped over the small southern town, casting shadows across quiet streets, the stage was set for a confrontation that would send ripples through the community. One man's prejudiced actions would soon clash with the unwavering determination of a son seeking justice for his father, forever altering the town's landscape. The impact of what would unfold next would shock everyone and serve as a profound lesson on the repercussions of discrimination. The following morning was clear and bright, but a tense energy seemed to permeate the air, as if something monumental was brewing. News of the incident at Tom's diner had spread like wildfire, with townsfolk abuzz over what might happen next. Tom Harris arrived at his diner early, as he always did, to begin his daily routine. However, his eyes immediately landed on a small gathering outside. A group holding signs with messages like, "No to racism" and "Equality for all." A wave of anger washed over Tom as he pushed past them, fumbling with the lock and entering the diner, his hands shaking. He tried to carry on with his regular tasks, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. Every time the bell jingled above the door, he flinched, half expecting to see John Carter, or perhaps the authorities walking in. As the morning wore on without incident, Tom started to relax. Maybe, he thought, the whole thing would soon be forgotten. But just as the lunch crowd began to trickle in, the door's familiar chime sounded, and Tom looked up to see an imposing figure entering. Tall and impeccably dressed, the man carried an aura of authority that put Tom instantly on edge. "Are you Tom Harris?" the man asked, his voice calm yet edged with steel. Tom nodded, barely able to muster a response. "My name is Michael Carter," the stranger continued, locking his gaze on Tom. "I'm John Carter's son. I think we need to have a discussion about what happened here yesterday." Tom's mind raced. He had heard whispers about John's son being involved in politics, but he had dismissed them as town gossip. Now, faced with this reality, a flash of fear stirred in him, but it was quickly overtaken by his pride. "Look," Tom replied gruffly, "I don't care who you are. This is my establishment, and I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Michael's expression didn't shift, but there was a glint of warning in his eyes. "Is that so?" he replied, his tone measured. "Then perhaps you could explain to me on what basis you denied service to my father, a decorated veteran and long-standing member of this community." Tom's cheeks flushed red with anger. "I don't have to answer to you," he snapped. "Your father and people like him aren't welcome here." A hush fell over the diner as patrons watched the interaction, both horrified and transfixed. Michael Carter stood perfectly still, his calm demeanor laced with barely contained anger. His voice, low and controlled, held a force that made Tom take an involuntary step back. "Mr. Harris," Michael began, "I had hoped we could have a reasonable conversation, but I see now that isn't possible. Let me make myself clear. What you did yesterday wasn't only morally wrong, it was also illegal. I intend to use every available resource to ensure you face the full consequences." Tom's face faltered. "You can't do anything to me," he protested, though his voice lacked its usual strength. "This is my business." Michael's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "Oh, Mr. Harris," he replied, his tone dripping with irony, "you have no idea who you're dealing with. I'm not just John Carter's son. I'm a United States Senator, and I've dedicated my career to fighting the kind of prejudice you displayed here yesterday." The color drained from Tom's face as he absorbed Michael's words. He had unwittingly antagonized the father of a powerful senator, a man who could indeed make his life exceedingly difficult. "This isn't over," Michael warned as he turned to leave. "Expect to hear from me soon." As Michael exited, a wave of murmurs swept through the diner, the realization dawning on everyone present. Tom stood frozen, the weight of his actions sinking in. He had thought he was upholding his values, beliefs his father had passed down to him. But now, confronted with the consequences, he began to question if those values were worth the price he was about to pay. Unbeknownst to Tom, Michael Carter's visit was merely the beginning. Justice was already in motion, and Tom's life was about to be irrevocably changed. The small southern town would soon become a focal point, challenging its inhabitants to confront the hidden biases within their seemingly peaceful community. Outside the diner, Michael Carter walked away, pulling out his phone. "It's done," he said, his voice steely. "He's just as obstinate and prejudiced as expected. Time to proceed with the next phase." Inside, Tom Harris was a shaken man. His hands trembled as he served coffee, spilling half of it on the counter. The weight of his actions bore down on him, relentless and heavy. He had always seen himself as a pillar of the community, a good man who stood by his beliefs. But now, faced with the reality of what those beliefs had cost him, doubt began to creep in. Tom couldn't shake the sense that his world was on the verge of collapse. Each time the bell above the door chimed, he tensed, half expecting federal agents or lawyers to storm in. But rather than a dramatic confrontation, what came was something more unsettling: the quiet judgment of his own community. Loyal customers, who had been frequenting his diner for years, avoided his gaze, and some didn't show up at all. Those who did were unusually silent, their usual friendly banter replaced by uncomfortable stillness. Tom could feel their eyes on him, almost hearing the silent condemnation hanging in the air. As the day neared its end, Tom slumped into a booth, his head in his hands. The diner, typically bustling with the dinner crowd, was eerily empty. For the first time, he began to consider that perhaps he had made a serious error in judgment. Across town, John Carter sat alone in his modest living room, surrounded by old photos and mementos from his service days. He held a framed picture of himself and his late wife from the day he returned from the war. They looked so young, so full of hope for the future. "Oh, Margaret," he whispered, tracing her smiling face with his finger, "what would you say if you could see this?" The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke John's thoughts. A moment later, the front door opened, and his son, Michael, entered. Father and son embraced, the recent painful events hanging heavily between them. Settling into their seats, John asked, "How did it go?" Michael clenched his jaw. "As expected, he won't be changing his mind easily. But don't worry, we have a plan." John nodded slowly, sadness flickering in his eyes. "It's hard to believe. I always thought we had a mutual respect, Tom and I. Learning that he sees me as less than human because of my skin color, it hurts, son. It hurts deeply." Michael held his father's weathered hand, his gaze steady. "I know, Dad, and that's why we have to make this right. This isn't just about you. It's about every person of color in this town who still faces prejudice. We have to stand up to it." John looked at his son and saw the same fire and passion that had driven him to fight for justice in his own youth. A mixture of pride and sadness filled him. This wasn't the world he had hoped to leave for his son. But he was grateful Michael had the strength to face it head-on. "What's the next step?" John asked, his voice firm. Michael's eyes glinted with determination and a hint of a plan already in motion. "Well, Dad, here's where it gets interesting. I did some digging and found out that Tom's diner is in more financial trouble than he lets on. He's been trying to sell it for years." John's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Selling the diner?" "But it's been in his family for generations." Michael nodded. "Exactly. But with the right offer, especially after recent events, he might just take it." John leaned back, processing the information. "What are you planning, son?" Michael's smile was firm and confident. "Let's just say Tom Harris is about to get an offer he can't refuse. Soon, that diner will symbolize something far different from what it stands for now." As night fell, the seeds of change had been planted, setting the small town on a course that no one could have predicted. Tom's world was about to be turned inside out in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. The coming days would force the entire community to confront their biases and question the status quo. The next morning, Tom arrived at the diner earlier than usual, plagued by sleepless hours of haunting nightmares about mobs and lawsuits. Unlocking the door, he noticed a thick envelope on the ground. With trembling hands, he opened it to find a formal-looking document. As he scanned the contents, his face went pale. It was an anonymous offer to buy his diner at nearly double its market value through an unfamiliar law firm. A note at the bottom read, "This offer is time-sensitive and requires your immediate departure and an agreement not to start another business in the area." Tom's mind raced. Who would make such an offer, and why now? He hated to admit it, but his diner had indeed been struggling. He had often thought about selling, but had always resisted, clinging to his father's legacy. Now, with the backlash from his actions, this offer appeared as a lifeline out of the trouble he had created. Still, something felt wrong. The timing was too convenient, the conditions too exact. As he stood there lost in thought, the bell above the door jingled, and he looked up to see Sarah, his longtime waitress, enter. She stopped short, her face filled with concern and disappointment. "Tom, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He quickly shoved the letter into his pocket. "I'm fine," he said curtly, "just a lot on my mind." Sarah's gaze softened with a mixture of worry and sadness. "Tom, what you did to Mr. Carter yesterday, it wasn't right. People are talking, they're saying they won't be coming back here." A surge of defensiveness overcame Tom. "It's my diner, and I'll serve whoever I want." Sarah flinched, and Tom instantly regretted his outburst. He ran a hand through his graying hair, feeling older more than ever. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean to snap. It's just, everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to make it right." Her expression softened further. "Maybe you could start by apologizing to Mr. Carter. It's not too late to make things right." Tom clenched his jaw. Apologizing went against everything he'd been taught. His father's voice echoed in his mind, filled with the same old prejudice. But for the first time, he found himself questioning those ingrained beliefs. Across town, Michael Carter met with local leaders, his plan unfolding in the determined faces surrounding him. Michael's voice, steady but passionate, filled the room. "What happened to my father wasn't an isolated case," he declared. "It's a symptom of a deeper issue in our community. But we have an opportunity here to turn this into something meaningful, to spark real change." The head of the local NP chapter, an older woman, leaned forward. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Senator?" she asked. Michael smiled. "We're going to buy Tom's diner." A wave of surprise swept through the room, and someone asked, "Buy it? Why would we do that?" Michael explained, "We'll turn it into a place that unites people rather than divides them, a symbol of community and progress right at the heart of town." As he shared his vision, the initial skepticism in the room faded, replaced by a sense of excitement and hope for what they could accomplish. Meanwhile, John Carter sat on his front porch, lost in his thoughts as memories he had long buried surfaced. In his mind, he was back in the thick jungles of Vietnam, surrounded by chaos. He could see, as clearly as if it were yesterday, the face of Tom Harris Sr., his fellow soldier and friend. They had fought side by side, depending on each other in an unforgiving environment. Then came a fateful day when a young black recruit, terrified and inexperienced, made a tragic error that cost several lives, including Tom Sr.'s best friend. John remembered how this incident twisted Tom Sr.'s mind, filling it with resentment. In his grief, he blamed that young soldier, and eventually all black people, for his loss. John had watched his friend succumb to bitterness, unable to see beyond his pain and realize that the true enemy was war itself, not race. Returning to the present, John felt a pang of sadness as he understood that Tom Jr.'s prejudice had been passed down from his father. It was a cycle born of pain, but understanding its origins didn't justify it. John knew that real change could only happen if this cycle was broken. As Tom was closing the diner for the evening, a knock at the door startled him. Looking up, he saw Michael Carter standing outside. For a moment, he considered ignoring him, but something in Michael's expression held him back. Reluctantly, Tom opened the door. "We're closed," he muttered gruffly. Michael nodded. "I'm not here as a customer, Mr. Harris. I want to talk." Tom hesitated before stepping aside. The two men stood in the quiet diner, an invisible weight of history and prejudice between them. "I know about the offer you received," Michael said without delay. Tom looked surprised. "How?" he stammered. "Doesn't matter," Michael interrupted. "What matters is what you're going to do." Tom's shoulders sagged. "I don't know," he admitted. "This place is all I have. It's my father's legacy." Michael's voice softened. "Is this really the legacy you want to carry on? The legacy of division and prejudice?" The words struck a nerve in Tom. For the first time, he questioned the beliefs he had clung to all his life. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. Michael stepped closer. "I want you to choose a different path, Mr. Harris, a path that breaks free from the hatred of the past." As Tom looked into Michael's eyes, he didn't see anger or accusation, but a spark of hope. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. The walls around his heart began to crumble, and he felt the beginnings of change. Little did Tom know, but this decision would not only transform his own life, but ripple through the entire community, challenging others to confront their own biases. The next morning, Tom stood outside his diner, keys in hand. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door, knowing this might be the last time. The familiar aroma of coffee and food filled the air, stirring memories of his father teaching him how to run the place. Slowly he walked to the office, sat down, and looked over the offer letter once more. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed the number at the bottom. "This is Tom Harris," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I'm calling about the offer to buy my diner. I accept." As he hung up, a wave of relief, mixed with sadness, washed over him. It was done. His family's diner would soon belong to someone else. Yet, amid the sadness, he felt a glimmer of something else: hope. Across town, Michael received a text notification. Glancing at his phone, he read the message and smiled. "It's done," he told his father, seated across from him at breakfast. John Carter nodded thoughtfully. "So what now?" he asked. Michael's smile grew. "Now, we start phase 2. It's time to transform that diner into a place that brings our community together." Over the following weeks, the town buzzed with rumors and curiosity. News of Tom Harris selling his diner spread quickly, and speculation about the new owner was rife. Some thought it would become a franchise restaurant, while others whispered about a potential upscale cafe. However, when the truth was revealed, it stunned everyone. On a sunny Saturday morning, the diner reopened to a crowd of townsfolk eager to see the changes. At noon, the doors opened, and John Carter welcomed everyone with a warm smile. "Welcome to the veterans' table," he announced proudly. There were murmurs of surprise. The very man who had been turned away from this diner was now its owner. John invited everyone inside, and they gasped at the transformation. The walls now bore photographs and memorabilia from various wars, honoring veterans of all backgrounds and races. The booths were upholstered in deep blue, reminiscent of military uniforms. But the most striking feature was a mural at the back, depicting a diverse group of soldiers standing together in solidarity. At the center were two figures, a young black soldier and a young white soldier, arms around each other. A tribute to the friendship and legacy of John Carter and Tom Harris Sr. In the middle of the room, John spoke to the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "This diner has long been a part of our community, but it's also been a symbol of division. Today, we're turning it into a place for unity, understanding, and healing." He explained that Veterans Table would not just be a restaurant but a community hub, hosting events that promote dialogue and bring people together. The crowd's surprise turned to enthusiasm. People began nodding, and a few wiped away tears. As John concluded, he gestured toward the kitchen. "And now, I'd like to introduce our new head chef." The doors swung open and everyone fell silent as Tom Harris emerged, dressed in a crisp chef's uniform. He stepped forward, his head bowed, bracing himself for the crowd's reaction. But instead of scorn or anger, he was met with curiosity and respect. Tom took a deep breath and faced them, ready to embrace this new chapter. Tom began to speak, his voice unsteady. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. What I did, what I believed, was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong." He paused, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "But John and Michael Carter have given me a chance I don't deserve. A chance to learn, to grow, to be better than I was. And I promise to spend every day trying to earn the trust they've placed in me." The diner was silent as Tom's words sank in. Then, slowly, someone started clapping, then another, until the whole room filled with applause. It wasn't forgiveness. At least not yet. But it was a recognition of the difficult path Tom was starting on and the courage it took to admit his mistakes openly. When the applause finally faded, John stepped forward again. "This is what the Veterans Table is about," he said. "It's about second chances. It's about healing old wounds and building a future together. And I hope each of you will be part of it." With those words, John officially declared the diner open. People started to mingle, tasting the food and exploring the transformed space, and there was a noticeable sense of change in the air. Old divisions were beginning to fade as conversations started, and the community was beginning to heal. In the kitchen, Tom worked alongside his new team, a diverse group he would never have considered hiring before. With each dish he prepared, and each smile he received, he felt the weight on his shoulders lifting bit by bit. He knew the path ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. John and Michael Carter stood nearby, watching their vision come to life. "Do you think it will work, Dad?" Michael asked quietly. John's eyes sparkled with optimism. "It's a start, son, a good start, and sometimes that's all you need to change the world." As the day wore on, the Veterans Table buzzed with activity. People who had never spoken before now shared tables, swapped stories, and found common ground. The walls that had divided the community for years were beginning to crumble, one conversation at a time. In the weeks and months that followed, the Veterans Table became more than a diner. It became a symbol of hope and transformation for the entire town. Regular events brought people together to discuss challenging topics, bridging divides that had existed for generations. Tom Harris, true to his word, worked tirelessly to earn the community's trust. He listened, he learned, and he changed. Slowly, people began to see him not as the prejudiced man he once was, but as a testament to the power of redemption. The story of the Veterans Table spread far beyond their small town. News outlets picked it up, amazed by the transformation of both the diner and its former owner. A documentary filmmaker even approached John and Michael about sharing their story with a wider audience. But perhaps the most profound moment came nearly a year after the diner's reopening. Tom Harris Sr., who had been living in a nursing home in another state, came to visit. Now frail and wheelchair-bound, he was a shadow of the strong, bitter man he had once been. As John wheeled him into the diner, Tom Sr.'s eyes widened in astonishment. He took in the mural, the diverse crowd, and his son working side by side with people he would have once despised. For the first time in decades, Tom Harris Sr. began to cry. "I was wrong," he whispered, gripping John's hand. "All these years I was so wrong." That day, surrounded by the warmth and unity of the Veterans Table, old wounds began to heal. Tom Sr. shared stories of his time in the war, not with bitterness, but with a new perspective. He spoke of fear, chaos, and the shared humanity of soldiers on all sides. As the sun set on that remarkable day, John Carter stood outside the diner, gazing up at the sign that now read the Veterans Table. He reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this point. The pain, the struggles, and the moments of doubt, all of it had led to this transformation. Inside, the diner was still bustling with activity. Through the window, John could see Tom Sr. surrounded by a group of veterans, young and old from diverse backgrounds, listening to him intently, nodding in understanding, and offering words of support. John felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Michael beside him. "You did it, Dad," Michael said softly. "You changed everything." John shook his head, smiling gently. "We did it, son, all of us, together." As they stood there watching the scene inside the diner, neither of them could have imagined the ripple effect their actions would have on the world. Yet the story of the Veterans Table was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter a new chapter that would touch lives far beyond their small southern town. The next morning, as John was preparing to open the diner, he received an unexpected call. It was from a producer at a national news network. They wanted to feature the Veterans Table and the remarkable change it had inspired in the community. At first, John hesitated. He hadn't done any of this for fame or recognition. But as he considered it, he realized that sharing their story could inspire others to take similar steps in their own communities. So he agreed to the interview. The day the news crew arrived, the whole town buzzed with excitement. People gathered outside the diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cameras, maybe even be interviewed. Inside, John sat at one of the booths with the mural of diverse soldiers behind him as a powerful backdrop. As the interview began, he spoke openly about the incident that started it all. The pain of facing blatant discrimination, and the choice to respond with love and understanding instead of anger. "It would have been easy to meet hate with hate," John said, his voice calm and steady. "But that would have only continued the cycle. Instead, we saw this as a chance for growth and healing." The reporter then turned to Tom Harris, who had joined them in the booth. Tom's hands shook slightly as he started to speak, but his voice grew stronger as he shared his journey of transformation. "I was raised to believe certain things," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Beliefs I now know were wrong. It took this experience, and the grace that John and Michael showed me, to open my eyes. I'm not proud of who I was, but I work every day to be someone I can be proud of." As the interview went on, other community members joined in, sharing their experiences of how the Veterans Table had changed their lives and brought people together who might have never crossed paths. Clearly moved by the stories, the reporter asked John what he hoped others would take from their story. After a moment's thought, John replied, "I hope people see that change is possible, even when facing deeply ingrained prejudice. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But with patience, understanding, and a willingness to see each other's humanity, we can build a better world." As the news crew packed up, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. Everyone knew that once their story aired, things would never be the same, and they were right. The feature aired on a Sunday evening during prime time, captivating millions of viewers with the story of a small southern town's journey from division to unity. Social media exploded with reactions, calls flooded the network, and the Veterans Table became a trending topic. In the days that followed, people from across the country visited the diner, drawn by its message of acceptance and healing. But it wasn't only tourists who came. Community leaders from other areas reached out, eager to learn how they could bring similar changes to their towns. John and Michael found themselves fielding calls and emails from all over the country, people seeking guidance on how to bridge divides and promote healing. Their story even caught the attention of filmmakers who wanted to create a documentary, not just about the Veterans Table, but about broader issues of prejudice, forgiveness, and community healing. As filming began, John, Michael, and Tom found themselves revisiting the events that had brought them here. It wasn't easy. Reliving painful memories resurfaced difficult emotions, but it also reminded them of how far they'd come and strengthened their resolve to keep moving forward. The documentary crew captured everything: the daily life at the diner, community events, and the ongoing journey of healing and growth. They interviewed locals, veterans who had found a home at the diner, and even people who were initially skeptical. One of the most powerful moments came when they interviewed Tom Harris Sr. Despite his declining health, he spoke with raw honesty about his own prejudices and the healing power of love and forgiveness. "I carried anger for so long," Tom Sr. said, his voice weak but steady. "I let one terrible moment in war define an entire group of people. But seeing what my son and John have built together has opened my eyes. I just wish I'd learned this lesson sooner." The story of the Veterans Table took on a life of its own with each screening, captivating a diverse global audience and sparking countless conversations on the possibility of transformation and healing. The documentary began by portraying the initial incident at the diner with unflinching honesty, capturing the painful realities of racism and prejudice. Many in the audience were visibly moved, gasping as Tom Harris's past actions were shown in stark contrast to his journey of redemption. As the narrative unfolded, revealing the changes in Tom, the healing of a divided town, and the role of John and Michael Carter, the atmosphere in the theater shifted. By the end, the entire audience was deeply affected, with many moved to tears. The thunderous applause that followed was a testament to the power of this story. When John, Michael, and Tom took the stage for a Q&A, they were met with a standing ovation. Audience members engaged thoughtfully, with one asking John how he found the strength to forgive Tom. After a pause, John responded with conviction. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about choosing not to let hatred consume you. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those who have wronged you. It's not easy, but it's necessary if we want to move forward as a society. Another asked Tom what he would say to those who held similar prejudices. With visible emotion, Tom answered, "Holding on to hate blinds you to the beauty in others. I wasted so many years in anger. Don't make the same mistake I did." The documentary's impact was immediate and far-reaching. A major streaming service acquired it, allowing millions worldwide to watch and discuss it. This ripple effect reached living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces, leading people to examine their own biases and discuss paths toward healing. Closer to home, the diner saw a surge of visitors, eager to experience the sense of unity it represented. John, Michael, and Tom soon found themselves speaking at conferences, sharing their story and emphasizing that meaningful change is possible anywhere, with commitment and compassion. With more visitors and expanded operations, the Veterans Table also launched a mentorship program, pairing veterans with at-risk youth, a powerful success that brought renewed purpose to both veterans and the younger generation. Communities across the country were inspired by the story. Initiatives similar to the Veterans Table began to spring up, from small towns to large cities, as people gathered to bridge their own divides. The story continued to grow, and one day, John received an invitation from a prominent civil rights organization to speak at their annual conference. Stepping into a room filled with activists and leaders, John, Michael, and Tom were humbled to realize how far their journey had come, from a small-town diner to a national movement for healing. At the conference, the organization's president acknowledged their impact, saying, "You've provided a roadmap for healing. You've shown that change is possible, even in the face of deep divisions." Inspired by this message, the organization announced a national initiative modeled after the Veterans Table, aimed at promoting community reconciliation across the nation, with John, Michael, and Tom as advisors. Back in their town, the Veterans Table continued its work quietly and steadfastly. The diner remained a place of solace, support, and connection, with veterans and community members gathering to share meals and stories. Tom, once a symbol of prejudice, grew into a living testament to redemption, embracing his journey of growth and change. One evening, as they closed the diner, Tom reflected with John, "I was just thinking about my father, how proud he'd be of what we've built, and how sad he'd feel knowing he let bitterness take so much of his life." John placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, saying, "Your father's story is a reminder that it's never too late to change. It's part of what makes this place special." Then Michael entered with exciting news. "You're not going to believe this," he said, holding a letter. "We've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize." The three men shared a moment of disbelief and quiet pride. They knew this recognition wasn't just for them, but for every person who had embraced the diner's message of unity. As they locked up that night, they gazed at the glowing sign above, a symbol of hope in a world often marked by division. The story of the Veterans Table was far from over, with each visitor, each conversation, and each shared meal adding a new chapter in America's journey toward true equality and understanding. And to think, it all began with a single act of forgiveness in a small-town diner. What would you have done in John Carter's position? Could you find the strength to forgive and build something positive from a painful experience? Share your thoughts below. If this story resonated with you, check out the next heartwarming story we've picked just for you. Click here to watch.